Welcome to another virtual educational presentation by the North Carolina Maritime Museum. My name is Ben Wunderly, and I'm an Associate Curator at the museum. This program will give a brief overview of the history of oyster harvesting in North Carolina. The oyster is a bivalve mollusk that can be found in the inshore coastal waters of our state. They are free-floating in the larval stage, but settle onto a substrate where they adhere and remain the rest of their lives. Oysters experience the tidal changes of the estuary and begin filtering plankton from the water once they are submerged. People from around the world have been eating oysters for many, many years. When European explorers first came to the New World, they knew exactly what to do with them. The Native American Indians of the region had already been enjoying the eastern oyster for some time, though. Scenes such as this oyster midden pile were proof that the oysters were consumed by the native peoples. As early as 1823, state officials began to realize that rules were needed to be put in place to ensure that the resource was not exploited. By the 1850s, fishermen were encouraged to secure leases for transplanting oysters and seeding the area for the purpose of oyster farming. This was an effort to reduce pressure on the naturally occurring oyster reefs of the water. The easier and more common method for harvesting oysters was dredging those naturally occurring reefs. Scenes like this at the dock were commonplace. Newspaper ads, such as this one seen here from the Daily Journal-Sun out of Wilmington, advertised for local fresh oysters. By the late 19th century, a boom in the oyster industry was underway. This article out of the Charlotte Democrat described a canning operation at Beaufort. It seemed that the supplies of oysters would never run out. This image is of a typical vessel that may have been used for oyster dredging. It was built in Smyrna and Carteret County in 1891. Due to a high demand for the product and overfishing of the resource, conflicts emerged in the Chesapeake Bay between oystermen. These problems filtered into North Carolina when out-of-state oystermen began harvesting in the Pamlico Sound area. This article from the Wilmington Morning Star, February 5th, 1891, explains how armed guards were eventually placed to patrol North Carolina's waters and rid them of outer-state fishermen. Due to the immense size of North Carolina's oyster fishing grounds, the boom continued into the 20th century. This image is of the canning factory at Beaufort. Other factories were located at Elizabeth City, Washington, New Bern, and Morehead City. Many people were employed in the canning plants. Here they are, shucking the product and eventually filling the cans to be sold at market. Scenes such as this oyster harvest from the early 20th century would become less common. This article out of Elizabeth City from 1921 mentions the depletion of the resource. Due to overharvesting of the naturally occurring oyster reefs, many regulations would have to be enacted. In the early 20th century, biologists began to study the possibility of creating man-made oyster reefs in an effort to replenish the stocks. This article from the New Bern Weekly Journal in 1915 explained how biologists at the U.S. laboratory in Beaufort had success in planting oysters. It was eventually realized that the excess amount of shell from the processing facilities could be used to create a suitable substrate for oyster larvae to adhere to once it was placed in the water. Large amounts of old oyster shell could be loaded by barge and hauled to a preferred site where it could be dumped into the water in an attempt to reestablish an oyster reef. Due to the decimation of the large naturally occurring oyster reefs that existed in the deeper water, most oystermen resorted to the shallow areas. This image shows some fishermen harvesting oysters right from the shoreline at low tide. They would fill their small skiffs and take them back to a processing facility. Here they unload the baskets of oysters and take them inside, where you might see a scene such as this one. After the oysters were shucked, they could be prepared by steaming or by a process using high pressure water. They would be canned and ready for market. Today, most people prefer their oysters fresh, whether steamed, raw, or roasted. There are many statewide efforts to promote the oyster industry in North Carolina, and there is many volunteer and nonprofit movements to help improve the water quality where oysters live. We thank you for watching this presentation and hope that you enjoyed it. For more information about the management of North Carolina's oyster fishery, contact the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. For more information about presentations by the North Carolina Maritime Museum, please visit our website.